Ambassador Velkotrin had read 400 years of intercepted human broadcasts, and none of them had prepared her for how quiet Earth actually was. She stood on the observation deck of the Concordium flagship, Averted Certainty, looking down at a blue and white planet that, by every metric her analyst could produce, should have been screaming. The intercepted signals, decades of them, harvested by listening posts scattered through the system's asteroid belt, showed a species obsessed with violence. Their entertainment depicted wars that spanned continents. Their news channels cataloged conflict after conflict, century after century, an unbroken chain stretching back as far as their recorded history went. Their children were taught in exhaustive detail exactly how their ancestors had killed each other, as though the lessons of slaughter were something to be preserved rather than buried. The Concordium's Threat Assessment Board had spent 11 years studying this. 11 years, and the conclusion had been unanimous. Humanity was not a young species stumbling toward the stars. It was a mature species that had simply never stopped fighting long enough to notice it should. They should be transmitting military chatter, said Administrator Osk, hovering at her side in his humidified support frame. His people had joined the Concordium 900 years ago and had not fought a war in 600. Fleet movements, defense postures, something. There's nothing, Velkotrin said. No build-up, no mobilization, just commerce, weather reports, music. Then they don't know we're coming. She wanted to believe that. It would have been simpler. But 11 years of study had taught her that humans rarely did the simple thing, and the silence beneath her did not feel like ignorance. It felt like the stillness of something that had already decided how the conversation was going to end, and was waiting for her to finish talking first. Bring the fleet to alert status, she said, quietly. The vote had taken 3 years. The Concordium was not a single government, but an alliance of 41 member species, bound by a founding principle so old it was carved into the entry arch of their central assembly hall. No species advances past its cradle by consuming its neighbors. It was a doctrine born from bitter experience. 3 of the founding species had themselves been conquerors once, and had rebuilt their entire civilizations around the guilt of it. So when the analysts first flagged Earth, the Concordium did not send a fleet. It sent linguists. Then it sent historians. Then, 3 years and several thousand hours of translated media later, it sent the vote to every member world. Humanity, upon reaching interstellar travel, will constitute the single greatest existential threat this alliance has encountered in its recorded history. Recommend immediate, decisive, preemptive neutralization. The vote was not close. 38 in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 dissent, a small, aquatic species called the Thren, whose ambassador had stood before the assembly and said something that nobody had taken seriously at the time. You have studied their fiction, the Thren ambassador had said, her translator flattening the urgency out of her voice. You have studied their history. You have not once asked yourselves why a species capable of such violence has not yet destroyed itself. There is something you are not seeing. I do not know what it is, but I would rather find out before we provoke it than after. She had been outvoted. The fleet was already being assembled by the time she finished speaking. 211 ships crossed the dark between stars over the course of 8 months, running silent, running dark, converging on Sol from 7 different vectors, so that no single point of origin could give away the size of the invasion before it arrived. It was, by Concordium doctrine, an overwhelming force, enough firepower to sterilize a system twice Earth size, deployed against a species with, as far as anyone could tell, no fleet at all. Velkotrin had not wanted overwhelming force. She had argued in the last committee session before departure for a demonstration, first, a show of strength in the outer system, an ultimatum, a chance for the humans to understand what they were facing and simply stand down. She had been overruled. Overwhelming force, the committee reasoned, was the only ethical option. A war ended in a single day caused less suffering than one drawn out by half measures. Strike fast, strike total, and it would be over before humanity had time to organize a real defense. Now, watching the quiet blue planet grow larger in the Averted Certainty's forward viewport, Vel-Katrin found herself hoping the committee had been wrong about something else too. She hoped there would be a defense to organize. She found she did not like the alternative, arriving to find nothing at all, and calling that a victory. She got her wish. 3 hours out from Earth orbit, the sensor arrays lit up. "Contact," said her tactical officer, a compact, four-armed Vern named Syl. "Multiple contacts." "There, Ambassador, they were already here. They were waiting." 40 years earlier, a single Concordium scout vessel had entered the Sol system, run a standard 3-day reconnaissance sweep, and vanished. This was not unusual. The Concordium lost scout ships occasionally, to navigational hazards, to mechanical failure, to the simple vastness of space swallowing a signal before it reached home. The loss of the Quiet Herald had been filed, mourned, and forgotten, one data point among thousands that had gone into the eventual threat assessment. What nobody in the Concordium knew, what nobody could have known, because the humans had never said a word about it, to their own public or to anyone else, was that the Quiet Herald had not been lost to mechanical failure. It had been found, tracked from the moment it entered the outer system by a joint radar network that 31 nations had spent a decade building in the wake of a near-miss asteroid that had detonated over the Pacific with the force of a small city's worth of ordnance. That asteroid, close enough to end an argument about funding, far enough away to end it without ending anyone, had done more to unify Earth's defense posture than a century of treaties. What had once been a patchwork of competing national space programs became, within 18 months, a single coordinated planetary tracking and response network, built quietly, funded jointly, and kept almost entirely out of public view, because governments had learned, the hard way, that populations panicked more efficiently than they cooperated. So when a ship of unmistakably non-human design entered the system, decelerated in a manner no human engine could replicate, and began a slow, careful survey of Earth's defenses, the response was not panic. It was silence. Every satellite, every ground station, every listening post on 6 continents watched, recorded, and said nothing to anyone outside a room with fewer than 40 people in it. The Quiet Herald left after 3 days, apparently satisfied that Earth possessed nothing worth reporting. It never made a home. A joint Russian-American interceptor platform, disguised as a derelict communications satellite and stationed in a decaying orbit, specifically so it would look abandoned, matched the Scout's outbound trajectory, and put 2 kinetic rounds through its unshielded engine housing at a combined closing speed of 40 kilometers per second. There had been no explosion, no drama, no debris field visible from Earth. Just a ship that was there, and then wasn't, its wreckage tumbling silently outward into the dark where no one would ever look for it. The 40 people in that room had argued for 6 hours about what to do next. Half of them wanted to reveal everything to the world immediately. The other half, the half that ultimately won, argued that a species which sent unmarked scout ships to survey a planet without so much as an attempted contact was not a species planning a friendly introduction. If they came back, they would come back to finish what the scout had started. And if that was true, the worst possible thing Earth could do was announce, to its own frightened population and to whoever built that scout ship, that it had absolutely no idea what it was doing. So they said nothing. And they began, very quietly, to prepare. The next 40 years were the least documented, least discussed, and most consequential period in modern human history, and almost no one alive knew it was happening. It did not look like a war effort. That was the point. A war effort could be seen from orbit, troop movements, factory conversions, the visible signature of a planet arming itself. What Earth built instead was something stranger, a series of ordinary-looking investments in ordinary-looking industries, each one quietly, laying groundwork for something else. Civilian orbital mining operations, framed publicly as a resource and colonization initiative, were designed from their first blueprints to be convertible. Refineries that could become weapons foundries within weeks, or haulers with hull frames rated far beyond what asteroid mining actually required. A planetary defense against impact events program, publicly funded and internationally praised, built a network of directed energy platforms whose stated purpose was deflecting incoming debris and whose actual capability, quietly documented in classified annexes, was considerably broader. Every nation's existing military research, decades of Cold War-era work on kinetic weapons, orbital mechanics, radiation shielding, and information warfare, much of it declassified, just enough to be shared across the joint program, and no further, was folded into a single unified doctrine, developed by a rotating council of officers who told their own governments only what those governments needed to authorize funding. The people who built this were, for the most part, never told the full picture either. An engineer designing hull plating for a mining vessel was not told why the plating was rated to survive weapons fire. She was told it was a safety margin, a conservative design choice, the kind of thing engineers signed off on without asking too many questions, because asking too many questions had never been part of the job. A software team writing targeting algorithms for debris tracking did not know their code would one day be repurposed, with minimal modification, to track something considerably more evasive than rock. Compartmentalization was not a policy. It was survival. If the Concordium ever did send a real fleet, the last thing Earth could afford was for its own preparations to leak through some enthusiastic engineers' conference talk. The 40 people who had watched the Quiet Herald die became 400, then 4,000. Then, by the time the second scout arrived, 11 years before the invasion fleet, a network of specialists across every spacefaring nation, bound together not by law, which could be broken, but by the simple, grinding awareness that they were the only people on the planet who knew what was actually coming. The second scout was not shot down. This time, Earth's watchers wanted information, not just a body count. They tracked it, recorded every emission it made, quietly triangulated its home vector from the angle of its approach and the drift of its outbound signal, and let it leave unmolested, its sensors finding exactly as little as the first one had. Somewhere in a classified facility outside Colorado Springs, a team of Xenolinguists spent 4 years picking apart the fragments of alien communication protocol the Scout had inadvertently leaked during a brief systems check, and slowly, painstakingly, began to build something no human had ever had before, a working model of how an alien mind organized a threat assessment. What they found unsettled them more than the ships had. The Concordium, it turned out, did not think in terms of individual malice. It thought in terms of statistical inevitability, the calm, bureaucratic certainty that a species behaving a certain way would, given enough time, produce a certain outcome. And that outcome could be prevented now, cheaply, or later, at ruinous cost. It was not going to attack Earth because it hated humanity. It was going to attack Earth because 41 member species had run the numbers and concluded that humanity was, mathematically, a problem best solved early. That was, in its own way, more frightening than hatred. Hatred could be reasoned with, or at least predicted. A committee that had already voted was a wall. The response Earth built was not a fleet meant to win a war of extermination. It couldn't be. The numbers, once the analysts modeled probable Concordium fleet sizes, based on the 2 scouts' apparent range and sensor suites, were not in humanity's favor, not remotely. What Earth built instead was a doctrine. Absorb the first strike, make the cost of the war so catastrophically, specifically painful that no rational committee would ever conclude a second attempt was worth it. Not victory through superior force. Victory through making defeat too expensive to be rational. It took 4 decades, 3 generations of engineers who never spoke of their work outside a locked room, and a level of cross-national cooperation that would have been unthinkable in any prior century, held together by nothing more than shared fear and the growing, terrible certainty that they were right to be afraid. By the time the averted certainty and its 210 companion vessels crossed the edge of the Sol system, Earth was ready in the only way that mattered. It was ready to make them regret it specifically. None of this would have meant anything without the people who built it, and almost none of them ever knew the shape of what they were building. Mei Lin Zhao spent 19 years designing pressure hulls for what she believed, sincerely, was a joint international asteroid mining consortium. She had joined straight out of graduate school. Drawn by the pay and by the strange, quiet prestige of the program, everyone knew it was important. Nobody could say exactly why, and asking too many questions was gently but firmly discouraged by supervisors who had clearly been told the same thing by someone above them. She noticed things over the years that didn't quite add up. safety margins that were absurd for a mining vessel, reinforcement patterns better suited to absorbing a targeted strike than a random debris impact, radiation shielding specifications that made sense only if the ship were meant to survive very close to something considerably more dangerous than the sun. She raised it once in her 4th year to a program director who listened patiently, thanked her for her diligence, and told her the specifications came from a risk model she wasn't cleared to review. She never raised it again, not because she stopped noticing, but because some part of her had already guessed the shape of the answer, and some part of her had decided she did not want to be the one who made someone else say it out loud. By the time the invasion came, Mei Lin was 51 years old, retired from active design work, watching the news feeds like everyone else on the planet bland, carefully worded bulletins about an unusual astronomical event being monitored by international space agencies. Phrasing so deliberately calm, it was almost its own kind of confession. She recognized the hull silhouettes in the grainy telescope footage immediately. Every one of them. She had drawn half of them herself on a mining consortium's contract over the better part of 2 decades, without ever once being told what she was really building. She did not feel betrayed. She felt, oddly, relieved. The particular relief of finally hearing a door close on a question she had carried, unanswered, for most of her working life. The first Concordium ship died 9 minutes into the engagement, and it died in a way that made no sense to anyone aboard the flagship. It was not destroyed by a weapon they recognized. Sensors registered a spike of kinetic energy, then nothing. The ship simply stopped transmitting, its hull integrity dropping to 0 in a fraction of a second, as though something had punched a hole clean through its reactor core from an angle that implied the shot had come from behind an asteroid nearly 900,000 kilometers away. "That's not possible," said Syl, staring at the tactical display. "There's no line of sight. There's no rail platform," said a voice from the analysis station. A young Vern technician named Dale, who had spent the last 4 years of his career studying the fragmentary sensor logs from the second Scout mission, and had, until this exact moment, been considered something of an obsessive crank by his colleagues for insisting Earth's civilian mining infrastructure deserved closer scrutiny. "It's not firing in a straight line. It's using the asteroid's gravity to curb the shot. I've seen power signatures like this before, buried in old Scout telemetry. Everyone thought they were mining equipment. Mining equipment doesn't kill a warship in one shot." "No," Dale agreed quietly. "It doesn't." Vel Katrin watched the tactical plot update in real time and felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the ship's climate systems. The Concordium fleet was arranged in a standard dispersed formation, 7 groups converging from 7 vectors, a formation designed to overwhelm a defender who had to choose which approach to prioritize. Earth's defense didn't prioritize. It engaged all 7 groups simultaneously, and it did so with a coldness that felt less like combat and more like an audit. What followed over the next 6 hours was not the battle either side had expected. The Concordium ships were larger, more numerous, and individually more heavily armed than anything Earth fielded. But Earth wasn't fighting ship to ship. Earth was fighting the entire engagement as a single coordinated system, decoy platforms that looked, on every sensor sweep, exactly like the mining haulers they'd been built from, drawing fire while actual weapons platforms, disguised as asteroid belt debris and orbital relay stations, engaged from angles the Concordium's targeting systems hadn't been designed to anticipate. Earth's ships didn't hold formation, because Earth's ships weren't organized into anything a Concordium tactical AI recognized as a formation. They were organized the way a supply chain was organized, redundant, distributed, and almost impossible to meaningfully disrupt by destroying any single node, because no single node was doing anything the others couldn't compensate for within minutes. An hour into the engagement, the Concordium fleet had lost 11 ships and destroyed, by its own targeting logs, 4 human vessels. It took another 2 hours for Dale to point out, with a particular horror of a man realizing he'd been right about something he desperately hoped he was wrong about, that the 4 destroyed vessels had been unmanned decoys, and that Earth's actual losses stood at 0. An hour and 40 minutes into the engagement, a Concordium destroyer named the Steadfast Accord attempted something no other ship in the fleet had tried. It broke away from its assigned vector entirely and made a direct run at the planet itself. Its captain gambling that a strike close to Earth's surface, where civilian population centers made retaliation politically costly, might force the defenders to hesitate. It did not work. The steadfast Accord died 40,000 kilometers out, intercepted by 3 separate weapons platforms that had clearly been positioned, well in advance, to cover exactly that approach, as though someone decades earlier had sat down and asked what a desperate captain might try once the battle stopped going according to plan, and had built an answer for it before the question was ever asked in earnest. Dale watched the destroyer's transponder wink out on the tactical display and felt something in his understanding of the engagement shift, quietly and permanently. This was not a defense reacting to an attack. It was a defense that had already imagined the attack, in all its variations, years before it happened, and had simply been waiting to see which variation the Concordium would choose to run. "They're not defending the planet," Dale said. "They're using the planet as bait. They want us to commit." "Then don't commit," Osk said, his support frame trembling. "Pull back. Regroup at the system's edge and reassess." Velkatrin almost gave the order. It was the same thing to do, the Concordium thing to do, the careful, deliberative, committee-minded response that had governed every decision this alliance had made in 3 centuries. But she looked at the tactical display, at the 7 scattered groups of her fleet, each one bleeding ships to an enemy that had not once shown itself in a form her sensors could properly resolve. And she understood, with a particular clarity that comes only in the moment it's too late to be useful, that retreat was not actually an option. It hadn't been an option since the first shot. Whatever was orchestrating this defense had already accounted for the possibility that the Concordium would try to withdraw, and had positioned itself accordingly. "Belay that," she said. "All groups, converge on my position. If we're going to lose ships, we lose them together, not scattered across 7 fronts." It was, she would later understand, exactly the mistake the humans had been waiting for her to make. Fleet Admiral Renata Osei had not slept in 31 hours, and she did not intend to start now. She stood in the command bunker buried 400 meters beneath what had once been, 40 years ago, a decommissioned missile silo in the American Midwest, one of dozens of similar facilities scattered across the planet, none of them officially acknowledged to exist, all of them staffed by officers who had spent their entire careers training for a single engagement they'd hoped would never come. The tactical display in front of her showed the Concordium fleet doing exactly what 4 decades of modeling had predicted a cautious, committee-governed alliance would eventually do under pressure: consolidate. "They're pulling together," said her second-in-command, a soft-spoken tactician named Rios, who had written much of the original engagement doctrine as a doctoral thesis nobody outside the program had ever been permitted to read. "Converging on the flagship's position." "Good," Osei said. "That's what we wanted." The doctrine had never been about winning a symmetric fight. Nobody who had built it, not the first 40, not the 4,000 who followed, not the 3 generations of quiet, unglamorous work that had gone into every hull plate and targeting algorithm, had ever believed Earth could outproduce or outgun an alliance of 41 worlds. The math didn't support it, and everyone involved had been told that plainly, from the beginning, so that no one operated under illusions about what they were actually building toward. What they'd built, instead, was a trap shaped like a planet. Every decoy Earth had fielded, every distributed weapons platform disguised as debris or derelict infrastructure, every asymmetric engagement across all 7 approach vectors, had been designed to accomplish exactly one thing: convince a rational, casualty-averse alliance that consolidation was the safer choice. A scattered fleet was hard to defend and easy to pick apart piecemeal. Any competent tactician would see that immediately, and any tactician trained under a doctrine of minimizing losses would move to correct it exactly as Velkatrin just had. But a consolidated fleet was a single target, and Earth had spent 4 decades building precisely one weapon designed to be used exactly once against exactly this scenario: a distributed strike network seated across dozens of disguised platforms throughout the system, whose full destructive yield could only be realized if every platform fired on the same coordinate, at the same instant, against a target dense enough to matter. It was in essence a very large, very patient, very expensive bear trap, built by a species that had spent 40 years convinced someone would eventually be foolish enough to step into it, and had refused to consider the possibility that no one would come at all a reasonable one to prepare against. Confirm firing solution, Osei said. Confirmed, Rios replied, his voice unnaturally level. All platforms report ready. Yield estimate, he paused, glancing at a number he had personally recalculated 4 times in the last hour because he did not quite believe it himself. Yield estimate is sufficient to disable or destroy the entire consolidated formation. Osei did not feel triumphant. She felt, mostly, the profound and specific exhaustion of a woman who had spent her entire adult life preparing for a single moment and had never actually let herself imagine what it would feel like when it arrived. 40 years of secrecy, compartmentalization, and quiet sacrifice, distilled into a decision she now had to make in the space of a few seconds, watching a species she had never spoken a single word to converge into the shape of their own funeral. They don't know, she said quietly, more to herself than to Rios. They still don't know what this is. No, ma'am. Do it anyway. The strike, when it came, did not look like a battle to anyone aboard the Averted Certainty. It looked like the universe itself deciding to close a fist. 41 separate platforms, mining haulers, relay stations, debris that had drifted through the outer system for what Concordium sensors logged as years, silent and unremarkable, fired within the same half-second window, every shot converging on a single volume of space where the consolidated Concordium fleet had gathered, exactly as intended, in a formation meant to protect its most vulnerable members by surrounding them with its strongest. There was no way to protect against an attack that came from 41 directions simultaneously, converging on a target that had, moments before, believed itself to be regrouping into safety. Velkatrin felt the flagship shudder, watched half her tactical display go dark in the space of 3 seconds, and understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to change anything, exactly what Dale had been trying to tell her for the last 6 hours. This had never been a battle. It had been the last stage of an experiment that had begun 4 decades earlier, with a scout ship that never came home, and every choice the Concordium had made since, the caution, the committee votes, the overwhelming force doctrine designed to minimize suffering by ending things quickly, had been quietly, patiently accounted for by a species that had spent 40 years learning to predict exactly how a careful alliance would behave under pressure, because carefulness itself had a shape, and that shape could be aimed at. 83 ships did not survive the strike. The Averted Certainty did barely. Its outer hull ruptured along 6 decks, its reactors scorched to a fraction of capacity, alive only because it had been positioned at the edge of the formation rather than its center. In the silence that followed, Velkatrin stood amid the wreckage of her own command deck, half her crew dead or dying, and did something that no Concordium ambassador had done in the 300-year history of the Alliance's military doctrine. She opened every channel her surviving systems could still transmit on, and she surrendered before a single further shot was fired. Nobody on the human side answered for 11 minutes. When the response finally came, it was not triumphant. It was a single calm voice, transmitted from somewhere on the planet below, speaking through a translation matrix built from 4 years of painstakingly reconstructed alien protocol. This is Fleet Admiral Renata Osei, Planetary Defense Forces, Earth. We accept your surrender. Do not attempt to leave orbit. We will discuss terms when your ambassador is ready. Velkatrin closed her eyes. How long, she asked, through her own translator. Have you known we were coming? The pause before the answer stretched long enough that she wondered if the channel had failed. 41 years, Osei said finally, since your first ship. The public did not learn the truth all at once. It leaked out the way most secrets that size eventually do, in careful sanctioned pieces, released by a joint council of governments that had spent 40 years deciding, in advance, exactly how much their own citizens should be told, and in what order. Because a species that had learned to plan for an alien invasion had also learned, somewhere along the way, not to underestimate the disruptive power of its own surprise. Mei Lin watched the first official briefing from her apartment, alongside several 100 million other people who were hearing, for the first time, that the unusual astronomical event of 3 months earlier had in fact been a war, that Earth had won it, and that the planet's various governments had known an invasion was likely for the better part of 4 decades. The reaction was not what any of the planners had modeled. There was anger, certainly. Entire news cycles devoted to the ethics of 4 decades of secrecy, town halls and parliamentary hearings demanding to know who had decided ordinary people didn't need to know their taxes were quietly funding a planetary war machine. There was fear, too, the delayed and retroactive kind, the particular vertigo of realizing a threat had come and gone without you ever knowing it existed. But underneath both of those, in a way none of the models had fully captured, there was something else. A strange, quiet pride, spreading slowly through a species that had spent its entire history unable to agree on almost anything, at the realization that it had, for once, agreed on the one thing that mattered, and had kept the agreement for 40 uninterrupted years without a single leak reaching anyone who might have used it against them. Nations that had spent decades disputing borders and treaties had built and staffed the same defense network without a single publicized betrayal. It was, by any honest historical measure, one of the longest, largest, and most successful acts of collective human discipline ever attempted, and it had been carried out entirely in the dark by people who mostly never learned what they were part of until it was over. Admiral Osei testified before an emergency joint session of the United Nations 8 days after the first disclosure, and was asked more than once by visibly shaken representatives how anyone could justify keeping something of this scale from the public for so long. "You're welcome to disagree with the decision," she told them. "I've disagreed with parts of it myself, more than once over 40 years. But ask yourselves honestly what would have happened if we'd told you at the start. Not what should have happened. What would have? Panic doesn't stay contained to one country. It doesn't respect borders any better than the threat did. We didn't keep the secret because we thought you couldn't handle it. We kept it because the plan only worked if the enemy believed we hadn't handled it either, and there was no way to fake that convincingly while also explaining it to 8 billion people in real time. It did not satisfy everyone. It was not meant to, but it was notably the truth, and in the weeks that followed, as the full scope of the quiet 40-year effort became public, the engineers, the compartmentalized programs, the generations of people who had built something without knowing what it was for something in the public mood began slowly to shift from outrage toward a harder, more complicated kind of respect. The Thren ambassador was the first member of the Concordium to set foot on Earth, 3 months after the surrender, and she did so with a delegation considerably smaller and considerably more nervous than protocol usually demanded. She had been right, and being right had not made her feel vindicated. It had made her feel, mostly, like someone who had shouted a warning into a room too loud to hear it, and was now standing amid the wreckage wondering if there had been anything else she could have said that might have landed. Admiral Osei met her delegation personally, an unusual courtesy that the Thren ambassador suspected was itself a message. Humans, she was beginning to understand, rarely did anything by accident. "Your species voted against the invasion," Osei said, without preamble, as they walked through a briefing room lined with screens no longer bothering to hide the scale of what Earth had built. "You were the only one. I told them there was something they weren't seeing," the ambassador said. "I didn't know what it was. I still don't entirely." Osei considered the question for a long moment. Around them, the room held the quiet hum of a species finally, for the first time in 4 decades, no longer needing to whisper about its own defense. "You studied our fiction," Osei said. "Our history. All of it, cover to cover, looking for a pattern that would tell you what we do." "Yes. And you found centuries of us fighting each other, killing each other, over land, over ideas, over nothing at all, sometimes, if you look closely enough." "Yes," the ambassador said again, quieter now. "That's not what you should have been looking for," Osei said. "Anyone can find a species that fights. The galaxy's probably full of them. What you needed to ask was a different question. Not whether we fight, whether we stop." The ambassador said nothing. "We've never stopped," Osei said. "Not once, not for longer than a generation, somewhere on the planet, for the entire span of our recorded history. But we've also never lost. Not really. Not permanently. Every single time something has threatened to end us, famine, plague, each other, an asteroid 4 decades ago that came close enough to end the argument about whether we needed to work together, we didn't get wiped out. We adapted, and we kept going. And the next generation built on whatever the last one learned, and did it a little more efficiently. 41 years ago, a ship of yours came into our system to look at us, and decided we weren't worth reporting on. We took that as information, and we spent every year since then getting ready for the version of you that would come back with an answer we couldn't live with. She gestured at the screens around them. Decades of quiet infrastructure, finally visible, finally explicable. You didn't fight a young species that panicked when it saw you coming. You fought the version of us that had 40 years to think about exactly what you do and exactly how you do it, and built something specific enough to answer that. If you'd come a generation earlier, before we'd finished, this would have gone very differently. If you'd come a generation later, it would have gone worse for you. You didn't lose to what we are. You lost to what we do with time, when we know something is coming. The ambassador was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the words, but the specific, deliberate absence of triumph in how they'd been said. Your admiral surrendered nothing, she said finally. The Concordium fleet surrendered to you. And still you're not gloating. Gloating's expensive, Osei said. It cost you the next 40 years, convincing everyone you meet that you're still the same species who did this. We'd rather you understood us than feared us. Fear fades. Understanding doesn't. The Concordium Assembly reconvened 4 months later, its membership considerably chastened. Its founding principle: no species advances past its cradle by consuming its neighbors, read aloud at the start of the session for the first time in decades, by request of the delegation that had authored the invasion vote in the first place. Earth was not present as a supplicant. It was present for the first time. As a species, the Assembly had voted to attack, and subsequently voted, unanimously and without abstention, to invite into permanent alliance membership, not out of goodwill, though there was some of that, but out of the plain, hard-won recognition that a species capable of what Earth had just demonstrated was infinitely more valuable as a partner than as an enemy, and that the alliance had come within a single catastrophic miscalculation of learning that lesson at a cost none of them could have survived. Vel Katrin, recovering slowly from injuries that would keep her out of active service for the rest of her career, gave the closing testimony of the session, speaking not as an ambassador anymore, but simply as someone who had been there. We asked the wrong question, she said, to a hall of 41 species who had, for 3 centuries, believed their doctrine of caution made them the responsible ones. We asked whether humanity could be dangerous. Every species can be dangerous. That's not a threat assessment. That's a tautology. The question we should have asked, the one the Thren ambassador tried to raise before we ever left port, was simpler. What does a species do with 40 years when it knows exactly what's coming, and it has no other choice but to be ready? She paused, looking out at an assembly that had, for the first time in its history, no confident answer to give. We know now, she said. We were the ones who found out. Below them, unseen from the assembly hall's viewport, but present in every quiet system readout the Concordium's remaining fleet still carried, Earth continued exactly as it always had. Not resting, not celebrating, simply going on, the way it always had. One generation quietly building on the last, waiting, as it always did, to see what came next. Mei Lin Zhao was invited, eventually, to a small, unpublicized ceremony held in a converted hangar outside Colorado Springs, alongside several hundred other engineers, technicians, and analysts who had spent decades of their working lives building pieces of something they were never permitted to see whole. There was no press. There were no medals. Admiral Osei, considerably older now, and walking with a cane she never fully explained, moved through the room and shook every hand personally, thanking each person by name for work that had, until a few months earlier, not officially existed. When she reached Mei Lin, she paused. You raised a concern about the hull specifications, Osei said. 4th year of the program. It's in your file. Mei Lin was startled it had been recorded at all. I never got an answer. No, Osei agreed. You weren't supposed to. But you were right to ask, and someone above you was right to make sure it was written down instead of buried. That's most of what this was, in the end. People asking the right questions and other people making sure the answers survived long enough to matter, even when they couldn't be given yet. She moved on before Mei Lin could find a response, and Mei Lin stood for a long moment amid the quiet crowd of strangers who had, without ever meeting each other, spent their lives building the same unspoken thing, and understood, for the first time, that she had never really been kept in the dark at all. She had simply been trusted with one piece of the light, and told to hold it steady until someone needed the whole picture. Outside the hangar, the sky over Colorado was clear and unremarkable, the kind of sky that had looked exactly the same on the day the Quiet Herald first entered the system 41 years earlier, and had gone on looking that way through every year of the silence that followed. Nothing about it had ever announced what was happening underneath it. That, in the end, had always been the point. The end.